With the rise of Trump, much has been written and spoken on the issue of the power of the American people. This is tied up with the issue of democracy. The fight against the people, or for the people, is linked with the issue of democracy. A fight against the people is considered a fight against democracy, and vice versa. If you oppose democracy, it is said you oppose the right of the American people to choose their own path. But at best, this is a proxy fight. No one actually advocates for the power of the people. Democracy is a proxy war in that at best, democracy is parliamentary democracy. The power of the people is vested in the ballot box and the power to vote in a representative. There are, as we know, various types of democracy, each with its own mechanisms and philosophies. Direct democracy is where citizens have direct participation in decision-making, typically through referendums and initiatives. This form of democracy can be seen in some local governments and specific policy decisions, allowing the electorate to vote directly on laws and policies. This type of democracy is practiced in Switzerland. Representative democracy, which is practiced in the United States, involves electing representatives who make decisions on behalf of the people. This form of democracy relies on the principles of elected officials being accountable to their constituents. The United States is characterized by a federal representative democracy, where power is divided between national and state governments. In the U.S., democracy is practiced through a combination of mechanisms at various levels of government. The federal structure allows for a separation of powers among the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, ensuring a system of checks and balances. Elections are held at regular intervals, with citizens voting for their representatives in Congress, the President, and various local offices. Furthermore, the U.S. employs a system of electoral colleges in presidential elections, which is a unique feature of its democracy. While this system has been subject to criticism and calls for reform, it remains a significant aspect of how democracy is practiced in the country. Overall, while the power of the American people is channeled through representative democracy, the system is designed to balance the will of the majority with protections for minority rights, ensuring a complex yet robust democratic framework. The protection of minorities and the people in general is enshrined in a constitution, though various other aspects of the American system make it difficult to push through reforms that would make it difficult for the governing party to get elected. In other words, while democracy can be subverted, so long as elections are held, too many policies that impact the people negatively will be met with a negative response at the next election. So, the vote, while relatively meaningless at the level of the individual, can be a powerful tool when a government begins to reflect an agenda that is opposed by the majority. Yet, there is a way to usurp power without rising the ire of the people, primarily because the power of the people is not enshrined in the right to vote. The right to vote is a clever ploy or diversionary strategy. The real fight is not at the ballot box but at the ledger. The ballot box is a Trojan horse or virus that, while promising the user power, is really a way to open a back door into where the real power is. But let's look at the problem with every democracy and system of government. Every government, no matter how it is elected or brought to power, has no funds to fund its existence, let alone its programs. Every government, no matter where it is on the political spectrum, is a parasite. First of all, by itself no state can make laws. Anyone can form an opinion. But this opinion can be ignored or challenged at any time. To function as a law, an opinion must be turned into a regulation, and this requires having the ability to enforce the opinion as if it were consistent with Kant's categorical imperative. It is not enough to just act as if an opinion was a universal law, we need the power to make others live as if our opinion was a universal law, or at least a nationally enforceable one. Herein lays the problem. If our opinion did constitute a natural law, we would not need the ability to enforce it. The opinion would be shared by all. But the reality is, no opinion is universal. Even the prohibition against murder is not universal, or there would not need to be laws prohibiting it, and what is more, explaining why killing is murder and when not. Not all homicide constitutes murder. There is justified homicide. The gap between justified homicide and first-degree murder is a large one and open to all sorts of qualifications. If we assume there are people who reject all killing of humans and others who take a more callous approach, it is obvious we cannot hold an opinion, nor write a law, that will please all persons. Therefore a compromise must be found. But since it is not possible to have debate on this at the national level and come to a resolution, democracy permits us to vote for the person who represents us and our position to the greatest degree. This seems to be a better solution to the problem of law than a tyranny. Democracy is not perfect, but the option to vote in the most compatible legislator compared with having a dictator thrust upon you by means of some process seems by far the better choice. But this is akin to asking which is better, a punch or a kick. If you prefer to be punched more than kicked does not mean a punch is a desirable option. Naturally, if you compare the option of voting in a government to having one thrust upon the nation by means of civil war, the common man will always want democracy. But of course, there are always those who want something the majority do not and think they can get what they want by means of tyranny. There is nothing to stop those who want the power of a dictatorship attempting to get elected by means of the democratic system. In other words, even in a democracy there are those who will subvert the democratic system to bring in a dictatorship, if they can. Democracies do not eliminate tyranny, they merely sublimate it in the expectation that democracy is better than a tyranny exercised by a group whose interests are alien to one's own. Too much in this world is done through intimidation and indeed, tyranny. Democracy is only accepted because of the threat of worse if it is not. This is textbook protectionism. We are told if we do not accept a democratic government the result will be a dictatorship. But so often what we have, if we do not comply, is a dictatorship. Try and not pay one's taxes, for example. Try to add an addition on your house without proper authorization by the state. If we do not like democracy or we do not like the alternatives, what can we do? There is no opt-out box to tick. There is no, none of the above, vote option. Dictatorship is a veiled threat directed at those who chose not to play along with the democracy game. The question is not whether the threat of a gangster ought to be taken seriously or have his bluff called. The question is, ought we be dealing with gangsters at all? However, let's look at the issue more closely. Let's assume we reject the tyranny of an overt dictatorship, but what happens when we become a democracy? First, we ought to assume we have not become a dictatorship and attempting to alleviate this condition. This has often been the case, as humans have attempted to reduce the power of a monarchy or other absolutist. But there is no absolute correlation. In other words, humans can exist in a state that is without democracy or tyranny. Let's assume this state is possible. Without the state, people must provide for themselves. Usually this is done within the context of a subsistence culture. Not saying there are not other choices, but assume the community sees a need to have a leader, but there is no leader that is unanimously supported. It is not difficult to imagine an election being held to pick the most popular candidate. But what then? The elected leader can either harangue his subjects and berate them until they decide to obey him, or he can create a method of coercion, which essentially means he has produced a tyranny. How bad a tyranny this is, depends on to what degree the people oppose him and to what degree the leader requires compliance. If the people agree with what the leader proposes, they will put themselves and their resources at his disposal. But this is never 100%. All new leaders experience what is called a honeymoon phase, which the people either love him or at least do not actively oppose him. But this soon begins to wane. How far he drops in popularity depends on a lot of factors, but it is inevitable. There is and always must be a tension between people and ruler. The nature of rulership, regardless of its type, always turns the resources of a place into a liability. A liability is an asset with competing claims. The state and private elements will always be at odds because deep down their interests are incompatible. Only an outside threat can bring them together and create a sense of consensus. This outside threat is the other incompatible aims of business and labor. However, the state has found it expedient to add another suite of competitors to the mix. These are the unemployed and other dependent groups, such as migrants. All these claims need to be mediated, and this is what gives the state its job. But it is the state that creates these groups and designs their claims on the nation's resources. The state assigns property to private commercial interests and defines their limited area of influence. But it also creates a category of ownership called personal ownership and zones and regulates the property within the category. But it is not the property that makes it personal or public or commercial, it is the regulatory power of the state that puts property in one administrative realm or another. Without the state, even in some rudimentary sense, there is no property in the private and public meaning of the term. Property is a legal term, and it requires a state and its authority to define and give it meaning. But here the state faces another problem, because if it just gave property to everyone who asked, it would have no power. The power of the state resides in its ability to withhold ownership from its subjects, as much as provide deeds to property. To get and retain property requires subjects be compliant with the state. This gives the state power over its subjects because the state has, artificially, created something the people want and cannot get anywhere else, but from the state, directly or by proxy. We buy property from the state or indirectly from the state when we buy property that was originally purchased from the state, from a private owner using a medium of exchange provided by the state. The state then provides one services as the broker of record, administrating the sale and purchase of the nation's assets. But the state only does this or can do this if the state retains a monopoly of power, which means in effect, a monopoly over the nation's assets. Without the state, the people would have direct access to property. With the state, the people lose this direct access. If the state is a tyranny, the right of the people to the national assets is taken from them by force. In a democracy, this right to the nation's assets is assigned to a representative. This representative must administrate the nation's assets in accordance with its power. But this power and right is contested by various parties. To win an election, the political party must always promise to do more than was done before by the incumbent. Which means the contenders need to promise to control more resources, each election cycle. So, the people vote away their power to gain more access to the property that was taken from them, not realizing that if the state was not taking their property from them, they would have direct access to these goods and services, and more besides, because they would not be paying the government to provide them indirectly.